Here's a special important message.
Hello, welcome to another episode of We Are the Road Crew, the podcast which talks to some of the people who are integral in the live music scene, behind the scenes, maybe behind the stage, right out in front of the stage, but not actually usually on the stage. It's been a little while. It's me, Stephen Hill, by the way. Hello, I'm your host, and thanks very much for tuning in to this episode. We're back with this one-off special episode as it falls on the 7th anniversary of one of the, I guess, most sort of infamous things to happen within the alternative music scene for the last decade or so, and that was the very, very shocking bus crash that happened to the band The Ghost Inside on the morning of November the 19th, 2015. On this show this week, we're going to be talking to Tim Irons, who was a crew member for The Ghost Inside. Tim grew up in kind of LA, and we had a really good chat actually. You know, he's kind of roughly sort of the same age as me. He was into a lot of the same bands that I was into when I was growing up, got into music through the same sort of thing and the same sort of scene, even though we are, you know, literally continents apart. And, you know, we talk a little bit about how much he kind of loved getting into punk rock and going to little DIY punk shows around California when he was a kid, and how that inspired him to start kind of living a life on tour with numerous bands, and the main one being The Ghost Inside. Now, if you aren't familiar with the story of what happened with The Ghost Inside and their bus crash on that day, Tim spells it out here in some really, really quite shocking detail. I think it's an incredible story. It's an incredible story in terms of what actually happened that day, and it's actually a really incredible story about, I guess, the strength of the human spirit to carry on after that, because Tim, you know, he will talk towards the end about what he's doing with his life now, and the fact that The Ghost Inside still do shows. You know, this is the sort of incident that really could have ruined lives forever, and did. You know, like, it's a shocking thing, and, you know, there is people who did actually lose their life, but the fact that Tim seems to have come through it and seems to have used it as fuel to make sure that he is happy within his life, I think is a real credit to him. So look, I don't want to say too much because I think Tim says everything in this episode, but yeah, this is a really jaw-droppingly phenomenal chat, and I just want to say thanks to Tim for coming on the show, and really, really thanks to Tim for being so open and honest and never kind of shirking what I imagine must have been a very, very hard story to tell. So anyway, enough from me. I'll be back towards the end, but here I am talking with Tim Irons. Okay, Tim, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Thank you for coming on. Thank you for talking about your life and career. We'll start, I reckon, where we start with kind of all of our guests here on the show. The first time you got into music, the first artist that inspired you to take an interest in music, can you remember that far back, and can you remember who they were?
So I remember going to the local record store called Sound Stations in Los Angeles, small little suburb there, and I got a No Doubt Tragic Kingdom CD. I got a Green Day Dookie CD, and I believe it was Offspring Smash on a cassette tape.
Wow.
That was like, and I had Coolio, R.I.P., recent R.I.P., Gangster's Paradise, or whatever that, I don't know what that album is, but on cassette as well.
On cassette? They're coming back, cassettes by all accounts.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of, like, people will do, instead of doing like a 45, they'll do a cassette tape. It's great.
Yeah.
I don't know where to play those, but
I was going to say, This is cred only. Surely you got to pull it out like punk rock cred badge. I've got a cassette of the new.
I don't think I have
power
anything
band
that would play a cassette. My dad has a Volkswagen van that plays cassettes, so I'll have to drive that around to listen to the newest hardcore split. So
you've got to get everyone pile in the back of Tim's dad's van if you want to listen to like whatever cassette he bought. I mean, that is a pretty amazing group of artists and really, really iconic albums. I mean, I think, you're chucking out Come the Walls by Rancid, and I think you've ultimately got like, the skate punk, ska punk, pop punk starter pack for the 90s.
It was great. I mean, it's also cool that they're both California bands. I think of like Green Day and No Doubt as the two that really shaped my music taste.
Very, very similar to yourself. Dookie and Smash, I do credit as two of the albums which really, really got me into alternative music in a big way. Probably the two albums that got me into alternative music in a big way. How did that kind of impact and affect you? That whole scene.
That whole scene at that time too. I was probably, I can't remember, maybe 8, but going into like double digits, teens. I've always been like a very emotional person, so I was able to relate to like the upbeat, angrier music. Listening to Billy Joe Armstrong like scream, I'm like, you're not scream, but you know what I mean. Like seeing you're rocking with him, and it like it gave me this outlet to be able to be like, oh, I'm not the only one that feels like I want to let loose and stuff like that. I had blue hair as well, like big Trey Cool fan. Blue hair, red hair, yellow hair, orange hair, kind of everything. My 8th grade graduation picture, I have orange hair and an orange shirt on. I look ridiculous, but
amazing.
Inspired by Green Day. So yeah, it shaped. That was like my gateway into rock music and sort of like the alternative scene. From there, it kind of went to NoFX, Thrice. Those were like the first, and then eventually branched into like hardcore music. Comeback Kid was one of the first bands. Strife. I was lucky enough too to have a local scene in a city called El Segundo, where I grew up in, and the teen center here, which is like a youth center. They had like ping pong tables, little skate ramps, all that stuff. They would put on shows, and so one of my first shows was Strife, Stretch Armstrong. I want to say like Scary Kids Scaring Kids at the teen center. And it was like $3 to get in, and it was, I think you had to be a resident too, so it was all people I knew. I remember going in, standing in the back and just being like, what the hell is this? This is awesome. I had no idea. I'd never seen that before because I'd seen videos or whatever of concerts on TV, but I'd never been to one. And then seeing that, going from an extreme of like, as a kid, I watched like Michael Jackson concerts, and I'm like, this is the opposite of that. I'm like, these kids are screaming and piling around and moshing and all this stuff. And I'm like, this isn't how this should be. But I was like, I like it. I got to get in there. So
yeah. I mean, you've kind of preempted my next question, which would have been, what was the first gig you went to? Because I think seeing music live is obviously what this podcast is about and what is kind of focused on the most. Obviously, getting an album is great and getting inspired by an album, but there's something about that first time you step into either an arena or, in your case, a hall, and go, wow, this is like the real deal. So were those like the first gigs that you ever went to?
Those were the first few for sure. But those were on a small scale. The first actual concert I went to was Britney Spears at the Staples Center.
Okay.
That was in seventh grade.
Yeah.
But yeah, like at the same time, I'm going to Britney Spears with this. It was like this girl's birthday party. She hired a limo, whatever. She was rich. We all had a box suite to see Britney Spears. And I mean, even that, I still remember it because it was so memorable of like the production value. There was like rain coming down at one point, and I'm like, how do they do all this stuff? But at the same time, I'm going to these like hardcore shows at a teen center, just getting sweaty, moshing with my friends. And I'm like, what weird opposite lives I lived with everyone. The Britney Spears one, props to her, man. She like huge impact on a lot of people too. And even me, like you wouldn't, you look at people in this world and you're like, you don't like Britney Spears. I'm like, I have this very specific Britney Spears experience and memory that I don't think a lot of people know about.
They do now.
They do now.
Which is cool, man. It's cool, man. I mean, like Britney is obviously she's back and she's been in the news a lot. But she was a huge star. I mean, like that must have been amazing to see. That's like seeing the most famous. I mean, what kind of era is it talking about? Like kind of Oops, We Did It Again kind of era.
Yeah, it was that era. I can't remember what the tour name was, but it was like right when she was at her peak. It was honestly phenomenal.
I mean, that's going to see the most famous person on the planet pretty much at that time, right?
Yeah, she was up there. Like I said, I grew up listening to Michael Jackson and stuff, and he was obviously huge at that time in the 90s. And she took over like the early 2000s, and that was when she was at her prime. And it felt like that almost, like a huge scale pop. Everyone knew every song, words, everyone's dancing. I'm like, this is pretty cool. Pretty cool experience.
But going back to the kind of the more underground punk scene, So when you discovered that, when you kind of came back from the Comeback Kid, Comeback Kid and Stretch Armstrong, by the way, is a really fucking cool sort of first gig to go to.
Yeah, it was Strife and Stretch Armstrong.
Oh, Strife, sorry. Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
No.
Even better.
Comeback Kid was my first show at an actual venue. Not a teen center or something like that, like a small venue, not the Britney Spears show. I was in ninth grade and I went to a Comeback Kid show and I was like, this is great.
So did that become like a place where you just felt like you had to go to, or like you kind of like gravitate towards there and see kind of whoever was on? Because, I don't come from a very big, place in the UK, but as soon as we had friends who started putting on shows in my kind of local surrounding town and village area, you just go and see every band just to be like, I want to be part of this scene and I want to be, like how quickly did it take for you to just feel like you were part of that scene and you were going to go to whatever show you could, pop along to?
It took a little bit, honestly, just because it was so new to me and it was so foreign and I didn't really know a ton of people at these shows. So it was like friends of friends, or like this kind of comes full circle, but singer The Ghost Inside, his brother's my age. So I knew his brother and I was like, oh, your brother is at these shows. I was like, what's this about? So I didn't really make that connection. And so a lot of my friends weren't going, but I knew these people. I grew up in a smaller suburb of Los Angeles called El Segundo. And I knew these people going to these shows, but I didn't know them very well. And they're older than me. They're like 4 years older than me. So I'm like, we didn't go to school together. Can I just approach these people? They look like they have a tight clique. They're all doing this together. And so I was kind of just like stood in the background and was like, okay, I'm just going to observe and like just kind of check it out and make my way in slowly. A few local bands too. I don't know if you know Let Live, the band, but they started.
I absolutely know Let Live. I love them.
Okay, yeah. I don't know how far they've reached in Europe and stuff, but they are a band that I grew up with. They're based in Los Angeles, and so they would play these small youth center shows. They would play shows at this place called Westchester Park, and it was just a indoor basketball court with a little stage. They would do like Halloween shows there. People would dress up, and I would again just be in the back, like, okay, I guess I know the singer of this band that was my brother's friend. So I kind of like had these weird connections, but it was never like they were my friends until I would say like end of high school was where I was like, okay, now I'm like an adult, I guess. And, I'm not a little dweeb kid anymore. But after that, they were very welcoming and I would get involved with local shows and I made t-shirts for this. They did this show called March Mustache Madness. And I made like these stenciled t-shirts and gave them out to everyone. But yeah, as far as going to the shows and being involved, I really immersed myself in that world and needed to be a part of it. Like you were saying, every show I saw a flyer for, I would go to, and I just couldn't get enough of it. It was great. It was awesome to have that outlet too, because I think back on it now and I'm like, if I grew up a city over, I don't think I would have had those shows and I would have been listening to, I don't know, whatever, Harry Styles. Yeah. No offense to Harry Styles, but it's like I would have been deep in pop music rather than having lived the life that I lived. So
was there a point where you thought to yourself, I want to go to these shows, and I mean, like you say, like making t-shirts and whatever, where you were like, right, okay, well, what can I do to kind of be fully part of this scene? Maybe to the point where, I mean, at what point did you start thinking, I might be able to make a little bit of money out of this, I might be able to make some kind of career out of that? Why did that transition happen?
That happened again, probably like end of high school, probably like senior year of high school I went to a community college. I didn't go to a 4-year college or anything. I didn't have big educational aspirations or anything. I knew I was like better working, better with my hands. School wasn't for me. I had friends when I was closer to high school. Like I said, that group of friends was like 4 years older than me. So they were touring. And I had a few friends that would play local shows and I would beg them to like jump in the van and be like, hey, you guys are going even to Orange County. I didn't drive at the time. So I was like, you're going to Orange County. Can I go with you guys in the van? Can I check out your show? Stuff like that. And then eventually one of my friends started touring with Bleeding Through, who was doing more national touring, supporting huge acts. They were on a Marilyn Manson tour at the time, one of 4, I think, opening that tour. And I remember just bugging him, being like, what can I do? What can I do? He's like, well, come meet the band. We'll hang out, see if you mesh, stuff like that. This was 2008. I was 20 at the time. So I'd been begging, to include me. What can I do? I'll load stuff. I'll do sound, lights, whatever I can get my hands on. And so eventually, and at the same time too, this whole group, Jonathan Vigil, singer of The Ghost Inside, is in this group. So he's like these 4 or 5 year older than me kids who I grew up with and kind of almost aspire to because they're like big brothers to me, but I see this cool clique they have. They're all friends. And I'm like, my friends kind of suck. Like I want to hang out with them. Those guys look like they're having a blast. And eventually immerse myself in it. And so I kind of would also bug Vigil about it and be like, what can I do? I'll sell t-shirts. I'll do anything I can. Just, I want to go. I want to see it. I want to go to all these live shows and be involved in it. So 2008, I went to this Marilyn Manson Bleeding Through. I can't remember who else was on that bill. But I hung out with the band, met them. We all meshed really well. And then kept bugging. This is my friend Pepe, Mark Pepe, who was their tour manager at the time, and bugged him. And then eventually in 2009, he's like, okay, we have this tour. You can sell merch for us. And I was like, are you kidding? I was like, this is incredible. Obviously dropped out of college, did all that stuff. He took me with him, and it was an interesting tour because the lineup was all over the place. It was Satyricon was headlining, and then direct support was Toxic Holocaust, the thrash band. So it's a black metal band, thrash band, Bleeding Through, who's like a screamo, hardcore. I don't even know what genre to put them in. And then there was a band from Taiwan opening that was like another black metal band. And I'm just like, this is the weirdest bill. So Bleeding Through got like booed off of a lot of those shows. It was kind of sad to see, but it's just like, you go to this band and you go to this venue and it's like, kids that want to see Satyricon and like, they're like that kind of metal kid. And then you have Brandon singing like clean notes and people are like, what is this? This is soft. Like, get off stage. And it's like, they're like, I don't know. It was just a weird match. So anyway, Bleeding Through got knocked off. They decided to leave the tour because they're like, this is not working for us. It's not.
Wow. I
think they just chose to step off because they're like, they're also toward the end of their careers. Bleeding Through was. They're kind of back now. They have a resurgence going with some shows happening.
Yeah. But
they were toward the end of their first term of their career, I guess. And they were like, you know what? This isn't worth it. We've been a band for 20 years and we're going to, be in the middle of this tour and we're getting booed. And they're just like, it's not worth it to be out here and doing this. So I continued on with the band from Taiwan, which was really cool.
All right.
They'd had nobody. We were sharing a bus at the time and they were like, hey, we have no crew. We're going to continue with this. Can you jump on with us? So I kind of took everything on and they were like, can you do lights? And I was like, I guess. I've never done it. So they had their singer showed me like a little bit of things to do on the light board. And I was like, yeah, I can do this. No problem. So I was selling merch, driving for them and doing lights and just helping them load stuff in, load stuff out. It was very cool. But yeah, they're a band called Chthonic, Chthonic. Very weird spelling. I don't know if you know that.
I always thought it was Chthonic. I always thought they were called.
I went off their pronunciation, which is Chthonic. So now we know the mystery solved. Yeah. That was a cool experience too, because they had 2 people that spoke English. The others did not speak English. We're on a full US tour with 7 people and 5 of them don't speak English. It's pretty bizarre.
Wow.
So, but it was fun. A lot of KFC. They like KFC. And then their bass player, Doris, and the singer, Freddie, are very politically active in Taiwanese politics and stuff. And at the time, which still is happening, there's a lot of tension between China and Taiwan. And there would be like older people coming to the shows, like 60s, 70s. And I'm like, what is happening? I'm selling merch. They would come up and buy like one of every t-shirt. And I'm like, what is happening here? This is the weirdest thing. And then I find out they're this politically active duo and they're like speaking out about the repression that China's putting on them, all this stuff. And these people would put us up in like penthouse suites and they would bring us platters of food and all this stuff. And I'm like, this is crazy. So that too, like gave me a better insight of how pivotal music can be in people's lives. And even just, obviously those people probably aren't listening to the music. They don't care about the music, but they're happy to see the platform being used for good. And I was like, there's a deeper meaning to all of this thing rather than just these people screaming on a stage, and they're not singing in English either. So I'm like, I don't know what they're saying, assuming it's all politically active stuff. But it was just cool to see. So that was like my first tour in a nutshell, which was kind of a bizarre thrown into the mix, like not orthodox tour, but I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it, and it was incredible.
That is a hell of a tour. What a story!
Yeah.
Like, you know,
It's crazy.
The punk kid on the black metal tour, when the punks like bail halfway through, and you end up with like this politically active Taiwanese black metal band. And yeah, man, amazing! What an experience. I mean,
it was great.
You must. This is something that I tend to talk to people, because I mean, I've done a few dates and like being a journalist or whatever, like going on tour with bands for a few days and stuff. I can't handle it. Like, even with quite big bands, I'm just like, I like, my own bed. I like my own space. Sure. I like to know when I'm going to be able to have a shower or what. Do you know what I mean? I like all that stuff. And I know that is not the attitude to go in with the touring lifestyle, right? That's no
the
good.
Opposite. Yeah. It's the opposite.
Yeah. So I feel like I am very definitely not cut out for it. And when I talk to people, some people just go, yeah, but a lot of people aren't. But I really, really am. Like, presumably you're one of those people who actually kind of
totally
enjoy and thrive in that environment, right?
Oh yeah, I love it. Like, that's like I'm saying, that's such an unorthodox first tour. So as far as like being adaptable and like things changed at the drop of a hat. It was like, oh, I'm on tour with this other band in a van now, going all over the US by myself, pretty much. I remember calling my parents and they're like, okay, whatever you want to do. And I was like, that's not really supportive, but like it's supportive enough for me to be like, yeah, I'm going to do this. Right? Yeah. It's totally weird, but yeah, it was. I've always been sort of that like carefree nomadic person, and I think it takes that like an adaptable is like, I would say that's the common denominator of everyone that I've met, is you just have to be able to go with whatever you're thrown. And some days that means, you're not going to get a shower and you're going to have to sleep on this person's floor or whatever it is, depending on the scale you start at. Obviously, like, I've slept on so many floors in my life to get where I've been, and that's fine. Like, but some people are like, nah, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that, which is fine. Everyone is different, and it's not meant for a lot of people. But I was hooked instantly and said, this is all worth it, to be able to see things. And just being at the show, like, before the show starts and like the band's on stage, they're kind of setting stuff up. That's like one of my favorite feelings. And I still, like, the other day I have friends on the Turnstile tour, and I went over to the Shrine. It's like 1:00, and I'm like, they're like, you coming to the show? And I'm like, I just want to watch you guys load in and like hang out and set up all your cables. I'm like, I just want to do that. So yeah, that feeling to me is like, it's like the calm before the storm. And that's my favorite time, is when it's like everything's set up and it's like, this is cool. Yeah. I mean, obviously during the show and like seeing fans go nuts and the band rock out, it's like, that's what I love too. But yeah, like a deeper thing is like totally nerding out about the setup and the logistics. And yeah, it's great.
Tell me you stuck around for the Turnstile show though, right?
I didn't stick around for the Turnstile show, but I saw them I saw them 2 months before. So it was like,
okay, fine. I'll let you off.
I saw them then, and they were, and it was crazy. What did I do then? I had to work a comedy show. Ben Schwartz. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ben Schwartz.
Not familiar with Ben Schwartz, I'm afraid.
No, yeah. He was on Parks and Rec. He did a comedy show, and a friend of mine, Dave Klock, don't know if you know Dave Klock. He is a poster artist. He does posters for like Sleep, Foo Fighters. He's doing a secret project right now for one of our favorite bands. Him and I share the same band. That'll be released soon. You'll see. But he does a lot of poster art, and he did poster art for this Ben Schwartz poster and asked me to sell posters at his show. So I said, cool. You know what? I'm going to help my friend out and go see a comedy show. And I saw Turnstile 2 months ago. Same songs. No big deal.
Yeah, no, bro. They're
just kidding. I like love that band, and they're incredible.
They really are. Yeah, very, very good. I want to know what happened after that tour. So what happens with your career? What do the next sort of few years look like, and what are any kind of big sort of career highlights for you?
So after that tour, like I said, Bleeding Through was kind of toward the end of their career. They took a little bit of a hiatus. They did a lot of one-offs or like California dates. So I would do those California dates with them. I worked at a hockey shop the whole time. That's like my other passion, is hockey and music. Those are the two things I love. But I worked at a hockey shop the whole time with Vigil. So Vigil would work at this hockey shop, and we would play hockey and just hang out. And I would still bug him about it, but it wasn't musically involved, I would say, for like another 4 years. It took a big break from that first tour to like one-offs, and then I would go to like all the Ghost Inside shows. I think they were still a dying dream at this time, like early on. And I would go to these shows with him and just kind of hang out, help him load stuff in. But it wasn't a musically heavy career for me at that time, which was totally weird. And then 2014, he asked me to come on tour with them and it was Devil Wears Prada, them, Danger Kids. I can't remember the other bands. But I was like, yeah, of course, I'll be there. Let's do it. I've been begging you for the last 8 years. I was like, I've been waiting for this time. And prior to that, they were in they had a little van. So they weren't they weren't at a level where they needed crew yet. They didn't necessitate any crew. So at this point they were like, okay, we're going on this bigger tour. We're going to share a bus. We need to do, I Killed a Prom Queen. Was on they shared a bus with us. That was another band on that bill. And so I said, yeah, we're going to share a bus. Let's do it. I'll do whatever you need. So I ended up doing, I think I did lights and helped merch, helped load in, and was just kind of like a general helper guy. Yeah. And I think my main task was doing lights with them because like I said, I had some tiny bit of experience doing it on that other tour, but he knew that I was capable of doing whatever. So, Vigil brought me on and he knew that I already was good with this band. Sorry, rewind a little bit. August 2013, Ghost Inside is going to Canada. And I was working in a warehouse at the time with my friend Pepe, who was the Bleeding Through tour manager. So it's all linked together. We've always looked out for each other. And they were going to Canada. And I said, hey, if I come meet you guys in Vancouver, because they were already on tour. I said, if I come meet you guys in Vancouver, can I ride with you the rest of the tour? They're going to ride to Eastern Canada and then they're going to play shows on the way home. And it was maybe over 10 days, something like that. I said, if I meet you at the first day, can I go with you? They're in a small, 4-bunk Sprinter van. And it was only the 5 of them and a merch guy. So I was like, we can fit 7 people in a Sprinter van, no problem. And he said, yeah. He said, let's do it. You already know the guys. You get along with them. Jump in. And I said, all right, cool. I'll meet you there. So I took the train up to Seattle, had a friend drive me from Seattle to Vancouver, jumped on this tour with them. I think they were opening or maybe direct support or something for A Day to Remember. They were opening. It was Day to Remember headlining, someone direct support, and they were opening this tour. And he's like, you could do lights if you want, whatever. Look at the Cowboy as Day to Remember's light guy at the time. And he's like, maybe Cowboy can show you some stuff. You can use a light board, whatever. And I was like, I would love to. I'd love to do that. So I jumped in. This is all free labor. I'm not getting paid or anything. I just want to hang out. I'm going to spend my own money to get up there and be on this tour with you guys because it sounds so incredible. That's how bad I just wanted to get on the road, I think. So I met them in Vancouver, did this whole Canadian run with them, and it was still such a memorable time. I think about it all the time. There was a moose that stopped. We had to stop in the middle of the road because there was a giant moose that stopped. It was wild. Did that whole tour with them.
Wow.
Came back home and was like, I need this. So kept bugging them. And I think for them, that was a test to see if I could really hang and really go with the flow. I think a few nights we didn't have hotels and we had to stay in the van. I'm like, that's fine. No big deal. I don't care. And so I think they used that as a test to see oh, okay, is he serious? This is, a 10-day run. If he can handle this, he can do a whole US tour, whatever it is. So then 6 months later, spring of 2014, they asked me to do that tour and I jumped on, did some lights, hung out with them, had a great time. Middle of that tour, I remember them saying, hey, we got asked to do Warped Tour. We're going to do Warped Tour. Do you want to come with us? I was like, yeah, what do you mean? Of course I do. So I dropped everything, quit the hockey shop, all that stuff, and went to do Warped Tour with these guys for a whole summer, which was insane. I don't know if you're familiar with what Warped Tour is, obviously, and
very familiar with Warped Tour, and I understand that it is a very, very unusual thing to do as well in terms of not knowing when you're going to be on and what stage you're going to be on. All those things are hard, right?
It's a very, very foreign feeling. It's not a normal tour. Like, you know where you're going, but like you said, you don't know what time you're playing. Every morning we'd have to wake up at 7:30. We would meet the gear truck behind our stage. We would unload everything together as a team. Every band's tech would be there. You know, you're lifting cases that aren't yours, putting them under the tents to each band. And it was great. It like built a camaraderie between a lot of the band members. And it's nice because or the crew member, sorry, but you get to meet these other crew members and work with them so that when other things arise, you can be like, oh, I remember on Warped Tour, this guy, he would unload like a beast every day. Like, we got to get him on our tour. We need a guitar tech, whatever it is. So it was awesome. But it's grueling. I would say 2 nights a week, I would get in my bunk and cry. Not a sad cry, but just like a mixed emotions cry, because I loved it so much, but I'm exhausted. It's like 6 days a week of this. We're not driving, but like, you're going all over the country. You're there for 10 hours, if that, some days. You're sweaty. You might not get a shower. I will note I was able to shower every single day of Warped Tour, which is like I'm so proud of that one.
That's pretty surprising, knowing what I know about the kind of how the circus of that runs. That is pretty amazing. It's crazy. Just to kind of fill in the blanks with the Ghost Inside at this point. So they've gone from, I think from the UK's perspective, at least I'm going to go from, because obviously I can't say too much about what was happening in the US, but when Dear Youth came out at the end of 2014, I distinctly remember their profile rocketing massively. What are they? What was that, 4 albums in, I believe?
Yes.
Yeah. And so they were a band that had been around for a while, but it seemed like they brought this record out and everyone said, this album's amazing. It's this is the time for this band. Like, I think, again, I can't really speak of the US, but certainly in the UK, every few years we have a hardcore band that we kind of go, they might be the ones. They might be the ones who do it. It was Every Time I Die, Let Live had it for a bit, and it felt like it was about to be the Ghost Inside that was going to happen. And it felt like they were in a really good place. Like when that record came out, that was a really, career-wise, a really, really good place for those guys to be in, right?
Yeah. So I remember on the Warped Tour dates, they were playing, I think in the US at least, their Get What You Give album brought a lot of notoriety and fame to them. A lot of people knew a lot of those songs. They still know them. They still play them live. They have like the big sing-along chant parts. I would say like 2 of those songs have those huge, big chant parts. But then going into that Dear Youth album and that summer on Warped Tour, there was a lot of push and a lot of buzz going on. Like, oh my God, the new album's coming, new album's coming. I remember seeing Epitaph posters at every date. They had a road crew that would put up, new album. And it was always Ghost Inside posters. I'm like, this is happening. I was like, this is cool. I'm here at a good time. There's a lot of forward momentum. I'm really excited for everything going on. So that tour ended, and I would say from that moment, it really kind of took off. And I as a crew member, I base it off of what mode of transportation you're in. So that makes sense. After that Warped Tour, I think we went back to a Sprinter van once because the budget, whatever. But after that, it was just bus. And I'm like, this is it. They're doing it. They need a bus. They have, 10 band and crew members, all this stuff. This is great. We're going to do it. And they're skyrocketing, and I'm here for it. I'm all fully on board. I'm fully invested. They're friends of mine and I love working for them. And it was just really cool. So we started, I would say that Warped Tour going pretty much until the accident, that full year was just full-time touring. And it was my life. Like I loved every bit of it and couldn't get enough of it. So I was on board fully. Well,
let's get to the incident that we're going to talk about, which happened on the 19th of November. What are your recollections and memories of that day? How did that all play out?
Yeah, that was a huge moment in everyone's lives. I mean, it changed our lives dramatically, every single one of us involved. I was awake for the most of it. So it happened about 9 a.m. So building up to it, felt like every other day, no big deal. The night before, we were having a Star Wars marathon at the time. So I know people think like they're rock stars, they're going to do all this cool stuff. And it's like, no, we ordered Domino's pizza. Everyone got their own pizza, of course. And we watched Star Wars. So nothing cool happening really. I mean, it's cool, but it's not rock star stuff. So that was the night before. Everything was going great. We had a bunch of shows going and everything was awesome. Shows were going great. We were building up to go to Australia the next month, and we had all these tours and travel plans already booked. Like our tickets to Australia were already booked for end of December into end of November into December. We were doing an Australian tour with a Day to Remember. It was like 14 days, and I think we were playing 5 shows over 14 days. So it was going to be a lot of hanging out in Australia, which is a rough life. Um, and so that morning, the morning of the accident, I woke up, and it was about 6:30. I noticed we had stopped. I woke up and I kind of had a stomach ache, and I went inside. Bus driver and I went to the bathroom together, kind of sat next to each other, said, "How's your morning?" Whatever. I said, "I got a stomach ache." It's kind of weird. Um, I mean, I had a whole pizza the night before, so not really a surprise. Um, so I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, taking care of my business. I get back on the bus. It's about 7 o'clock now. He gets gas, and I'm like, okay, maybe I should go back inside and get some Pepto-Bismol. My stomach kind of hurts. And I was like, whatever. I don't go back inside. So all this kind of plays into it because after this accident, I kind of think about every second and how things could have gone if things had changed. If I went back inside to get Pepto-Bismol, would it have been worse? Would it have been better? Can't think about that stuff anymore. So I'm sitting up, I'm watching TV. It's like about 7:30, maybe 8 o'clock now. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you know what? My stomach ache's kind of going away. I'm going to try to go back to bed for a little bit. We weren't supposed to get to the venue till maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock, something. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to go back to bed. I get back in bed, I'm in the last bunk way in the back lounge. Actually, we had bunks back there. And I'm laying down. I'm like, this is okay. My stomach ache's going away. I'm going to try to go to bed. And I start like dozing off, kind of waking up. And eventually, I guess I just pass out. And then the next thing I know, I wake up to, it feels like turbulence in an airplane, like the shaking feeling of just like, you can't see what's happening like in an airplane. You just feel the airplane shaking and dropping and kind of freaking out, and you don't know what the hell is happening. So that's the only feeling that I can really equate that to is turbulence on an airplane. And I hear people screaming. There's like a huge impact happening, and it's just the most chaotic feeling of my life. Like I have no idea how to even make sense of this and process this, because it's such a foreign feeling. You're like cruising in your bus, and all of a sudden it's just like it's like in a fantasy movie. It feels like a giant picked up the bus and was just like, "What's in there?" looking for people. It was like just the craziest feeling, and everyone's screaming. And then eventually we kind of like skid to a stop, and it's just the quietest moment of my life. There's not a single, other than a few people screaming, yelling, "What the fuck happened?" Other than that, it was like there was no traffic, there was nothing. It was like the most still moment of my life was right after the accident had happened. It was like, it was the weirdest thing. And then all of a sudden I was like, okay, we're obviously something happened. We're in an accident. I got to figure out what to do. So I look down. I'm stuck at this point now. My bunk, I was in the middle bunk, it's about waist high, knee high. Bunk above me, bunk below me, and my bunk had kind of clamshelled. So I was stuck in my bunk, trapped. I couldn't get out. And I could hear Danny, one of our merch guys, was the closest to me. I think he was in the bunk across from me or above. I can't remember now. And he was screaming, and he's like, I could see my bone sticking on my leg. And I'm like, what the hell? Like, what? Because at this, I can't see anything. I can't see out of my bunk. I know there's obviously huge destruction because my bunk is so damaged, but I'm like, what level of accident is this? What the hell happened? I was like, if you can get me out of my bunk, I'm good. I was like, my legs are okay. I can move all my ankles, my knees, everything. I'm like, I think I'm good. I was like, if you can try to get me out of my bunk, I can get everyone help. That was my first instinct. And so Danny, on his good leg, stands up and somehow with like superhuman strength rips everything above me off, and I'm able to squeeze out of a hole. We went back into the bus a few days later, and the hole was like about this big. It was very small. I'm not a small guy. So, yeah.
That's terrifying.
It's
thing.
everyone's worst nightmare if you're a touring band. It's like everyone thinks about it, but you're like, nah, not gonna happen. Like there have been so many times where I got in the bus and been like, ooh, I'm just an anxious person by nature. So naturally I'm like, oh God, worst thing's gonna happen, whatever. And so you talk yourself out of that. You're like, no, it's fine. It's not gonna happen. And so to be in this moment, it's like it's actually happening. Like it was crazy.
I mean, like you just said that you got out and you were like, I'm fine. I mean, were you fine?
Yes and no. Like in the grand scheme of things, I guess physically, I was the least injured of, I guess, Jim and I, but Jim ended up having more surgeries and stuff later on. I had 2 knee surgeries and my back is twisted and curved and all sort of messed up. But yeah, I was able to get up. So Danny finally got me out of that bunk. I squeezed through this tiny hole. I have a scar on my back from squishing out of that hole. There was like a piece of metal that gouged a piece out of my back. I was able to get out. I saw Danny, his leg, he had bones sticking out of his leg. It was insane. Our guitar tech, Tony, at the time was kind of next to him screaming. And he's like, I'm going to try to stand up. And I was like, you probably shouldn't. And he tried to stand up and he's like, I can't stand up. He ended up having 2 broken femurs and was unable to get up, obviously. And then Chris was in the back as well. And I finally got out of my bunk and looked, and there was a little back window that had popped out. And Jim was sleeping back there on a couch. Like most bunks are, they're like feet toward the driver, head toward the back. But Jim was perpendicular to that on this couch. That was his bunk he chose. And so I don't know what happened, if it was like through the impact or something else. Somehow he ended up outside, and he doesn't really remember details of that either. It was just happened so fast, but he was the first one out of the bus, and he was like, what the hell happened? And I remember getting out and I see Chris, he's like sitting toward the end of that window, and the bus was kind of tipped over halfway to where it wasn't fully upright and it wasn't laying on its side. It was kind of half between the two. And he's sitting on the edge of the window, and I'm like, are you good? And he's like, my ankle's hurt. He's like, I can't walk. And I'm like, okay. I was like, let me get out past you and like see what everyone else is doing, how everyone else is doing, what's happening. And I like get out, I jump down from this window and I look over, and Jim is just standing in the middle of the highway. It's like a 2-lane highway, middle of Texas, middle of nowhere, no buildings around. I don't have a cell phone. I'm in basketball shorts and a t-shirt. Don't even have shoes on. I'm like, what the hell is happening? I look at Jim and he just looks at me with the same reaction of like, what the hell? Like, where are we? What is happening? What just happened? No idea. So I look at him and I'm like, what is going on? And there's cars now. There's like a few people that have stopped and they're coming over and they're like, we called 911. And I'm like, you called 911? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And they're like, well, one guy was like, I tried, there's no service. And I'm like, please find someone with service who can get us help. Like, this is crazy. And I remember we were standing there, Jim and I, and there was a guy that went around the wreckage down the side of like the embankment and around us, honked and went, get out of the road. And I looked at him like, are you fucking kidding me?
Fucking hell.
What
right, an
I'm
arsehole.
like, what? Yeah, I'm like, that guy has more important shit to do than any one of us. My bad. Oh, it was crazy. That is still like to this day, I'm like, how can that guy be that insensitive? And just like, you can see there's a bus on its side, half missing, and you're going to say, get out of the road? It's crazy. So yeah, there was people that had kind of been walking around at this point that had stopped, just like civilians. And I guess one of them was like a volunteer firefighter that happened to be in the area. And he does this stuff. I guess this is like a common thing in this area because it's a 2-lane highway in the middle of nowhere, that there's accidents, unfortunately, that happen a lot. And he comes over to Jim and I and he's like, hey, don't go toward the front of the bus. And I was like, okay, like, what's up? And he's like, there's 2 dead bodies. And I was like, okay. And at this point too, like, I couldn't see behind the bus, so I couldn't see that there was another truck or another vehicle. I thought it was just us that had gone off the side of the road and like exploded. Like, it was crazy. And so my thought was, okay, it's the driver because he's at the front. And then I was like, it's either Vigil or Andrew there at the front on the impact side. I was like, it's one of them. And I look at Jim and I'm like, Vigil's dead? And he's like, no, we don't know. And we don't know that. And I'm like, I'm like, it's gotta be, he's the closest to the driver. And he's like, no, we don't know. We don't know. And I'm like, this is my best friend. Like, I grew up with your brother. I know your dad. Like, this is my best friend. And he's fucking dead. And he's like, no, no, we don't know. We don't know. I'm like, okay, I guess we don't know, you know? And so this guy has me go around. And so I run around the back of the bus and I see everyone else over time. And this guy gives me a notepad and he's like, I need you to write down, because I'm the only one that's like able to move around. Like Jim is like hobbling because his ankle's all messed up and he's like kind of shook. And I'm like, my knees hurt now at this point because the adrenaline kind of wore off, but I'm like, I'm the only one that's mobile. I guess I have to do this. So he gives me this notepad and he's like, I need you to write down everyone's names that's in your vehicle and their condition. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you know, there's these two dead bodies. I need you to identify them, all this stuff. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, I got to do this. This is what I got to do. And I'm like, all right, fine. So I get this notepad and I write down the five of us that were in the back lounge. I'm writing it down and I'm like, you know, they're alive, literally. Like, okay, this is crazy. Go to the other side of the bus and uh, I see Andrew, and Andrew's laying there just like I think I've heard him talk about this too, where he said it was like he like just focused on his breathing and like his, I call it internal chi of like keeping yourself calm. And I remember we kind of helped each other in that moment because I was like, hey, are you good? And he's like, yeah, I'm okay. And I'm like, okay. And at this point too, like, you couldn't see the extent of his injuries other than him just being there. Like, everything hurts. He's like, I can't really move. I'm just laying here. I'm like, I'm just going to lay here. And I was like, all right, you need water? And he's like, no, I'm good. And he just like kind of breathed and was like, we reassured each other that he was going to be okay. I saw our sound guy, Tissue. His name is Nathan, but he goes by Tissue. And he was also like, hey, I'm laying down. I was like, you need water? You need anything? He's like, I can't really get up. And I was like, okay. I was like, just lay here, dude. I was like, someone's going to come. They're going to help you. It's going to be all right. It's fine. And then I go over and I see Vigil. He's like in that same area and he has a huge gash on his head, like huge. And I always tell him this too. I'm like, I saw your skull that day. I was like, it's the most crazy thing in the world, but I could see his skull and he's shaking. He's like uncontrollably just shaking. And I'm like, do you need water? What can I do? And he's like, not really able to form complete sentences. He's kind of like shivering, but he's like, and I'm like, what is happening? I was like, I don't know. I don't have a medical background. I don't know if he's in shock or he's passing on. I'm like, what is happening? So I like try to feed him some water and he like kind of shakes his head and I'm like, there's someone coming for you. I was like, you're going first. I was like, you are in bad shape. Let's get you out of here, whatever. And so I write down on my notepad, like, you know, not good. And so at this point, that's 8 of us that have been sort of checked on this list. And the other 2 are Zach and one of our friends who was just hanging out with us. He's like Vigil's childhood best friend. Their families are tight. Like Vigil lived with him. He's like his brother pretty much at this point. And he joined us on the tour. He would pop in on tours and just hang out for like a week at a time. And he happened to be there at this time, which I feel kind of guilty about, but you know, he accepts it and stuff. So he was hanging out with us and I remember being like, okay, those 2 aren't really accounted for. And so I think like in my head, I'm like, are those the 2 that have deceased? I'm like, I don't know where they are. I don't know their status. Prior to that, I could hear Zach screaming and I could hear his name is Armando. I could hear Armando screaming. Armando was screaming for Jim, like, Jim, help me, get me out of this. And I'm like, because Jim was our TM. So he would always joke and be like, oh, Jim can get us out of anything. He's our TM. He can take care of us. And so he was like screaming for Jim. And I'm like, oh, fuck. Okay. At least he's alive. You know, I can hear them screaming. So eventually I like make my way over to the front of the bus. At this point too, there was like a helicopter that had landed and I kind of flagged him down and was like, this guy needs to go first, pointing at Vigil. I was like, he's got head trauma. Like he needs to get out of here. I was like, he's shaking. He's not really responding. Please take him first. And they were like, yep, no problem. They put him on a gurney. I can't remember if they took both of them, but Andrew, I think, was the next to go. And then Tissue and then kind of so on. So I go to the front of the bus at this point and I see Zach. Zach's up on like a pile of stuff. You can't even make out like I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but there's pictures of like the front of the bus, and it's just like piles of stuff. Like I could see the fridge from the bus, and then just like splinters of wood and clothes and fabric and cushion and metal. And I'm just like, you can't make any of this stuff up. I don't know what these items are, but he's laying on top of this big pile of stuff, and he's got a guy with him just sitting there, like feeding him water, kind of talking to him through the situation. And I'm like, Zach, are you good? And he's like, I can't move. Like it hurts to move my hips and my pelvis. And I'm like, then just lay there. I was like, someone's going to come help you soon. You're good. Just lay there. You got a guy there with you. It's fine. You know, you're going to make it, whatever. And then I go down to Armando, who's like under him in this pile of stuff. Like this pile of stuff Zach is on is probably like 6 feet high. Below him is Armando trapped in like a pile of stuff. Like his leg is pinched. And I'm like, how are we going to get Zach off of Armando to get Armando out? And there's like more people coming now, and like there's eventually a fire department and all this stuff, paramedics, and they're like coming in with this huge giant saw from the back side of the bus. I don't know if they didn't realize the bus was just blown open in the front, but they're like cutting into the roof, and I'm like, you don't need to do that. I'm like, the bus is wide open. I'm not a paramedic, this is not my job, but I was like, please. I was like, you're cutting into this thing, it's going to get sparks on their face. Like they don't need this. I was like, please just go around, whatever. So they eventually got Zach off this pile and moved him onto like a piece of wood or a gurney and got him off of this pile of stuff. And then we were able to lift everything off of Armando, and he was in like a weird mangled position. And I remember his arm was kind of stuck back, and his arm was kind of through this pile of stuff, and his shoulder was where one of the pinpoints were, where he couldn't move because he was trapped on his shoulder, and his arm started going purple. And I was like, you gotta squeeze something. So I gave him a water bottle, and he kept squeezing to like get the blood flowing. And eventually he was able to get out of there, and his foot was trapped. So I don't know if someone pulled him or what happened, but his toes got really wrecked. And eventually he had like 3.5 of his toes amputated. So then eventually after all that, I'm like, okay, there's these 2 dead bodies who I don't know who they are. I'm assuming it's our driver and maybe the other driver. I think at this point I had finally put together like, oh, there's a trailer over there that wasn't ours. I'm like, okay, so there's another vehicle kind of involved in this. And this group of like 5 men kind of pull me over, and they're like, okay, we need you to identify these people, because if neither of them are your driver, then your driver's still unaccounted for, and these 2 people were in the other vehicle. And I'm like, okay. And they had covered them with like these blankets or something, like a blue emergency blanket type thing. And I was like, okay, I guess I have. And I remember leaning into this guy's chest before they like reveal the guy. And I'm just like sobbing into this guy's chest. And he's like, you got to do this. You can be strong. You got this. I'm right here. And I was like, I don't want to do this. And he's like, I know you don't want to, but you have to. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, take a deep breath, and I'm like, all right, go for it. And he like takes this guy's thing off, and I'm like, I don't know this guy. I was like, I've never seen this guy in my life. So then I'm like, okay, I don't know who this guy is. You know, I can obviously recognize his face if it was someone I knew. I'm like, I don't know this guy. And they're like, okay, it must have been the other driver. And I'm like, all right, let's go to the second one. So they walk me over a little bit, and they're like, all right, same thing. I'm like, okay, I don't want to do this again, but I guess I have to. And so they take the blanket off of him, and they like, as they start taking it off, I see our driver's hooded sweatshirt that he would always wear. It was a gray hooded sweatshirt. And I'm like, that's our driver. And I kind of like turned away, and they're like, we need you to identify him. And I'm like, I'm not going to look. I'm like, I know this is our driver. That's his sweatshirt he wore every single day. I was like, that's Greg. Greg Hoke was his name. And I said, I wrote it down on my thing, and I'm like, this is your list. I'm like, please take your list. I'm done with this. And it was just, yeah, at that point they kind of just like dispersed away, and I was like, all right, I guess I'll just go back to Jim and hanging out with Jim. So I go back to Jim, and I'm like hanging out at the back of the bus, and eventually we like got Chris off of that windowsill, kind of set him down on the trailer so he was ground level and he could be taken away pretty easily. There was like some guy that kind of crawled into the back lounge area and hung out with Danny and Tony, who were still inside and too severely injured to get themselves out. So he was giving them water and like making sure they were conscious and not freaking out. And then eventually we had like what they call a meat wagon show up, which is like a big ambulance, essentially, that you have clip-in beds, and they essentially just stack victims into this when there's like a mass casualty incident, which is very dark to think about. And so they like take Chris away, they take Jim away, and eventually Tony and Danny got out through a gurney or crew or whatever. And I'm like walking around at this point. I'm like, hey, can I just sit shotgun? I was like, I don't want to go in the back of this ambulance. Like, I just was in this accident where I couldn't see what was happening. I would love to be able to see the road as we're driving. And they were like, no, you have to go for like precautionary reasons. You could have a broken neck. You just don't know it. He's like, we need you to chill out. And I was like, okay, I guess. So he like straps me to this gurney and clips me into the wall, like this far from the bunk above me. And I was like, hey, I was like, you got to move this bunk. I was like, I've been trapped in my bunk for like 10 minutes. I'm having claustrophobia. And he's like, okay, yeah, I guess. And I'm like, what are you thinking? Anyway. So then we get transported to the hospital. Don't really know what's happening. It's just a total clusterfuck. At some point, side note, Armando was able to see a cell phone from where he was laying. It was under a pile of stuff. He's like, hey, there's a cell phone right there. And I was like, okay. So I grabbed the cell phone, and it ends up being Zach's, which is huge because then we were able to call the band's manager, booking agent, kind of all of their resources to be able to sort of tell them what happened and get that ball rolling. So we have this phone that's Zach's, and I give it to Jim. Jim makes all the calls their manager, calls the booking agent. Booking agent is very well known, gets us wired with a local. This is outside of El Paso, Texas. So they take us all to local hospitals in El Paso, Texas. And Jim and I are kind of released. And while we're sitting there waiting for Chris to see what his status is, Jim finds out this lady, this local El Paso promoter lady, I don't know her name to this day, I wish I did, comes and picks us up. She brings us $1,000 and says, hey, this is for your hotel room, this is for whatever you need. And then eventually Jim and I go to the other hospital to see the 5 people who are in the worst shape. They're all in the same ER in the critical care unit. And Jim and I make our way over there. It's probably like 4, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock at this point. It's been 7 hours since, and we don't know the status. Like the last I saw Vigil, he was shaking with a massive head wound. Like, I don't know what had happened to him. And so we slowly got able to see one at a time. And they were like, oh, well, you're not family, you can't see them. And I'm like, we are going to see these people. I'm like, these are like our brothers. We can't just be left out. So eventually we get in, we see them, and they kind of give us a basis of like how they're doing. And I think everyone was like stable at this point. They were just worried about Vigil's head trauma and like the lingering effects of that. But they said everyone is like stable. And I'm like, this is fucking crazy. I use stable as like a loose term because I don't know the actual terminology and everyone's status at that point, but they kind of reassured us that like, hey, everyone's going to live, but there's going to be injuries, whether they're head trauma or, legs, whatever it is. And so we're just like, obviously hoping for the best, kind of blown away. And Jim and I are like, well, let's go get a hotel room. And so we go back to this hotel, and we're just like, I remember sitting on the bed and just, it was like silent. We're like, what do we talk about? Like, it's just the weirdest thing. And he's making phone calls. And I think I'd made like a Facebook post at that time or something, just saying like, hey, this happened, but like, I'm good and everyone is hopefully going to be good. And, one day at a time kind of thing. So yeah, it was just the weirdest thing. And I remember sitting in the stairwell. I think I called my girlfriend at the time, and I just had this eerie feeling that like someone was trying to kill me. It was like, I remember looking over my shoulders and being like, someone's gonna, and I think it like instantly, I was just hit with survivor's guilt, feeling like, why wasn't it me? Why wasn't I injured worse? Kind of whatever it is. And it was crazy. So that's that day, November 19th, 2015. Yeah, it's a heavy day with a lot of details that, like I said, I've talked about so many times, and I've processed years of therapy and all sorts of things to be able to handle this. And we all have, and it's crazy to see how strong the mind is, in many different ways, whether it's overcoming something or like the band situation, being so motivated to be like, yep, we're not going to let this affect us. We're going to play more shows. We're going to get back to it and figure out how it works. So,
I mean, it's such an insane story. It must have been the most phenomenally terrifying thing that anyone could ever go through. And it's such a long road back for everyone involved. And I'm sure, you know, like 5 years between, or nearly six years between that album coming out, and I guess 5 years between the crash and the new Ghost Inside album coming out. And, you know, I think it's been pretty well documented, you know, the effects, both kind of physically and mentally, what the members of the band had to go through. I mean, you just touched on it a little bit there about the kind of the therapy and, you know, a couple of knee operations and stuff. As it was about to come out of my mouth, my brain went, that's a really trite question you're about to ask. So I'm going to try and find a way to ask it in excuse my ignorance, but how do you ever you presumably don't ever get over that, really, do you?
right. I mean, it's not an ignorant question at all. It's a situation that you've never had to dealt with. I mean, we all deal with our own trauma in our lives, whether it's, you know, people we love dying or car accident or something traumatic. I don't know anyone without any massive trauma. You know, it's part of life, and it's something they don't really prepare us for as a kid. But it's huge to be able to have verbal and mental outlets. So, like for me, going to therapy is a huge thing. I still go to therapy and talk about this stuff. I know a lot of people are not against it, but some people are like, "Oh, I don't need that," and it's like, no, you'd be surprised, like you do. I think there was a few of us from the crash. We call ourselves the 10 now, just like the 10 of us that survived. I was going to say another huge part of this is we, as people sort of got better and regained normal life where they got their cell phones back and stuff like that, we had a group chat. So first it was just Jim and I, eventually, when we got cell phones back after the accident. And then we added Chris, we added Tissue, we added Armando, and then eventually, once Vigil was in a coma for a while, I believe it was medically induced so that his body could heal and his mind could heal, because like I said, he had that big head trauma. Eventually we added him back when he had a cell phone and kind of came to, and then it was the 10 of us from then on out, and we were able to have this sort of bond that you can't explain. Like, you know, the 10 of us went through this situation together, and we were able to talk about it, and we would say, hey, like, you know, I had a nightmare today or whatever it is. And we were kind of there for each other, which is a huge thing. And I can't imagine not having those other 9 people to go through this with. And I'm just so thankful that we're all able to bounce back. You know, obviously, like you were saying, you probably never get over it, which is true. It's always there. And I still have general anxiety. And sometimes I get in a car and I'm like, okay, you know, we're going to crash. And it's like, no, you kind of have to talk yourself out of it. But there's definitely lingering effects, both physically and mentally. Like, you know, my knee still hurts every time I play hockey or even just squat down sometimes. And it's like, that's the price I pay, but I'm here. So,
yeah, I mean, it's quite an incredible story. It's a terrifying thing, like you said, but
yeah,
I kind of wonder in terms of your career now, I mean, what's happened with you and being on the road since then?
It's been sidelined pretty much. After that happened, I didn't work for a few years because I was going through physical therapy, mental therapy, all that stuff. But I couldn't work for like 2 years because I had knee surgeries kind of back to back over a year and a half span. And then I had to go to physical therapy for another 6 months. So I wasn't cleared to work for a while. I had to move back in with my parents. Like, it was a huge adjustment. And eventually, I went back on the road and did a tour with Straight from the Path and was able to get in a van with them. Found it pretty hard to like sleep while we're driving. And it just didn't feel the same kind of thing. Like the love for it is still there, but it just has kind of been blanketed, I guess, like by this little like anxiety that I have in the back of my head of like something terrible happening. So I kind of honestly diverted those goals and those plans, and I do a lot of local shows at home. So I'll do like merch vending and stuff like that for whoever asks whenever they're in town. But there's like a whole community of that. So I do one-off shows. I would say four or five shows a month. So that's kind of how I stay relevant. But like I said, I still have a lot of friends. Like I went up to the Turnstile setup and hung out with them, and I have friends in Thrice, so I'll go see their sound check and stuff like that, and just kind of nerd out with the techs that come to town to get my little fix, I guess. But yeah, it took a huge toll on that career path. And sort of everything was ripped out from underneath us. And I felt it felt weird kind of getting back on the road and it not being with the Ghost Inside and just being like, this doesn't feel right. You know, I should wait for them till they want to play music again or whatever. And they kind of talked me out of there. Like, you can't just sit and wait for us. Like, we don't know if we're going to be a band again. Like, go and, you know, work and live your life and do this. So I was able to sort of adapt, and I worked in the merch world for a while, and but it definitely diverted my plans. Because at the time before the accident, I was like, oh man, we just did 2 European tours. We're going to do Australia, all this stuff. I'm like, this is what I want to do. And it's, you know, I was dead set. I'm like, I'm going to be a roadie the rest of my life. This is great. And this kind of shook everything up, and kind of diverted that, which I'm not upset about. Like, I definitely miss it sometimes, but I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. Like, I live at home, I have a great job, and I get to hang out with my girlfriend, my dogs, my cats, all that stuff. So pros and cons for sure, but it definitely shook everything up. As far as career path goes, I didn't know what to do. I had trouble navigating it, honestly.
It feels pretty cruel when we spent the first half of this interview talking about how you felt like you were one of those people who were cut out for life on the road and that nomadic lifestyle. And then to go through that and to kind of change your plans, you know, even though it's great to hear that you are doing stuff still and that you've found, you know, pleasure and enjoyment and sort of happiness within your life as well. That's obviously amazing. Still feels quite cruel that this event has, I mean, you know, lots of things are tragic about that event, and that's, for me, would be one of them as well, even though I guess you could say, well, you know, people have lost limbs and lives and all kinds of things, but it still feels like that's a kind of a bit of a cruel irony to get towards the end of this podcast on. But I am glad you're happy, Tim. I'm glad.
I'm happy. So to like expand a little bit more, when the Ghost Inside did their comeback show, they had me drum tech for them. And so I was like, you know what? This is incredible. I'm going to do this last show, and sort of nothing's going to top that, honestly. Like, you could say, hey, you know, Slipknot wants you to go tech for them. I'd be like, I would love to, but I'm like, I don't know, maybe like I should just have that last show be with the Ghost Inside and have that comeback show memory. And, you know, I think if that hadn't happened, I would feel a little more robbed, you know. But I think since that show happened and I was able to work it and immerse myself in it from like a working standpoint, it kind of gave me some closure and was like, okay, this is, you know, this makes sense, kind of thing. But I mean, it's definitely, like I said, I miss it, and it's, you know, but I think a big lesson that a lot of us learned is we can't sit and drag our feet and be upset. That's just something that we can't let ourselves do.
It's true. It's a crazy story. I mean, dude, thanks so much for talking to us. Thanks for being so open about it. And,
no problem.
You know, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, it's a wild story. I kind of remember hearing about it like it was yesterday, and the fact that it's now, you know, 7 years has gone by, and
it's coming up on 7 years. Yeah. It's crazy. They're doing that Rebirth Day weekend in Las Vegas in next weekend. So that'll be great to get out there and see them, and it's going to be awesome. I mean, I see them whenever they come to town. I saw them 2 weeks ago. So it's like, I see them all the time, but seeing them play shows is still something that still blows my mind. I watched them, actually. I brought my little sister, my 14-year-old sister, to the show, They played in Irvine with A Day to Remember a few weeks ago, and I sat in seats and watched them play from the front of house, and I was like, this is the first time I think I've done this in 10 years. I'm like, I'm not on stage, I'm not in the mix. Because even like they played a festival recently, and I went out and kind of helped on stage and threw out beach balls and just was involved in a certain capacity. But that was the first show that I was like actually sitting and watching, and it just felt so different. But
yeah, it's
I
amazing. It's
shed some tears, and my little sister's like, what? She kind of looked at me like, this is weird. I'm like, you don't get it.
When you're that age, you think you're immortal, don't you? You think everything's you're like, everything's fine.
Right.
Dude, thanks so much for chatting to us. It's been really, really cool.
No problem. It's been great. So happy
take care and good luck in the future. Thanks so much, man. Cheers.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
All right, there you go. Again, I want to say a massive thank you to Tim for coming on the show. I don't know how keen I would be personally if I had gone through something as just shocking and terrifying and life altering as that to come on and be so open and talk about it. So so much credit, and he's just was such a good dude. Do you know what I mean? We only spoke over Zoom for a couple of hours, but yeah, I really enjoyed the time I got to talk with him, and I'm really glad that he is kind of thriving and doing what he's doing now. So all credit to him, and thank you so much, Tim, for coming on the show. It was really incredible, and shout out to him. It's amazing. Anyway, we'll be back another time. I'm not sure exactly when that will be, but thank you very much for listening to the podcast. If you want to give us a little review, a 5-star review, obviously, on either Spotify or iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, wherever you're listening to this, if you want to give it a nice review, that would be much appreciated. If you give it like 2 or 3, I mean, there's really no point you doing that, and I'd be quite offended if you did do that. So give it a 5 or just walk away, I reckon. And anyway, we'll be back another time, hopefully with a guest and a story from someone within the music industry, which is as interesting as this. I mean, I think we've kind of, in terms of shocking content, I think maybe the next one will almost certainly be a bit of an easier ride. But thank you very much for listening. We very much appreciate that. And if you want to follow us, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Instagram, and you can find us on Twitter as well, which is @RoadCrewPod. So go over, give us a like in any or all of those mediums, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.